The cardboard box fell apart the moment Jake Mitchell lifted it, spilling its contents across his Denver apartment floor like scattered memories refusing to stay buried. Among the chaos of old photographs and forgotten paperwork, something caught the overhead light with an unmistakable metallic gleam. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized what shouldn't have been there. A single military commendation medal, partially hidden beneath a stack of his father's old letters, bearing the distinctive ribbon he'd memorized from childhood stories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His hands trembled as he picked up the bronze star, the weight of it somehow heavier than he remembered from the few times his father had reluctantly shown it to him. Sergeant Mike Mitchell had been a man of few words about his service, but Jake knew this medal represented something profound, earned during 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was finding it now, just weeks before he was supposed to ship out for his own deployment with the National Guard. But this medal was supposed to be gone. His entire family had told him so. Jake had been dreading this moment for months. Packing up his life in Riverside, Ohio, and moving to Denver for his new engineering job had been emotional enough without having to sort through the remnants of his father's life that had somehow ended up in his possession. When Sergeant Mike Mitchell died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years ago, the family had moved quickly to handle the estate. Too quickly, Jake now realized as he sat cross-legged on his hardwood floor, surrounded by boxes he'd been avoiding like radioactive waste. The apartment was a typical bachelor pad, sparse and functional, with minimal furniture and even fewer personal touches. Jake had never been one for sentiment, a trait he'd inherited from his father, along with his stubborn streak and his inability to express emotions properly. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of him and his dad at his high school graduation, both of them looking awkward in their formal clothes, neither quite sure how to smile for the camera. Moving to Denver had been an escape as much as a career opportunity. Riverside was a small military town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the sight of his father's old truck still parked at the VFW hall could send Jake into a spiral of grief he wasn't equipped to handle. The job offer from Morrison Engineering had felt like salvation, a chance to start fresh somewhere nobody knew him as Mike Mitchell's boy, or asked him when he was planning to follow in his father's footsteps. The apartment complex was modern and anonymous, filled with other young professionals who minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. Jake's neighbors were polite, but distant, exactly the way he preferred it. His unit on the 3rd floor had a decent view of the Rocky Mountains, though he rarely took time to appreciate it. Most evenings found him working late at the office or at the gym, anything to avoid the quiet moments when his mind inevitably drifted back to Riverside and all the things left unsaid. He'd been putting off dealing with these final boxes for months, telling himself he was too busy with work, too focused on preparing for his upcoming deployment. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He wasn't ready to face whatever memories they contained. His father had been a private man, not given to grand gestures or emotional displays. Mike Mitchell showed love through actions rather than words, through teaching Jake how to change oil and throw a curveball, through quietly attending every school event without making a fuss about it. The boxes had been sitting in his storage closet like time bombs, filled with the detritus of a life lived quietly and with purpose. Jake had grabbed them hastily during the estate cleanup, more concerned with getting through the painful process than with examining their contents carefully. His mother Carol had been overwhelmed with grief and the logistics of death, leaving much of the sorting to Jake's Uncle Tom, who had stepped in with the efficiency of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations through his work at the local VA office. Now, staring at the bronze star that wasn't supposed to exist, Jake felt something cold and unsettling settle in his stomach. The metal was real, solid, unmistakably authentic. But according to his family, his father's entire metal collection had been lost in a house fire at Uncle Tom's place, where they'd been stored for safekeeping during the estate process. The fire had been devastating, Tom had explained with tears in his eyes, destroying not just the metals, but also many of his father's personal effects and military documents. Jake had been heartbroken, but accepting. Accidents happened, and material objects, however meaningful, couldn't bring his father back. He'd focused instead on preserving his father's memory in other ways, volunteering at the local Veterans Affairs office and preparing for his own military service. The loss of the medals had felt like a cruel footnote to an already tragic situation, but he'd chosen to let it go rather than add more pain to his mother's grief. But here was proof that the story didn't add up. If this Bronze Star had survived, what about the others? His father had earned several commendations during his years of service, including a Purple Heart from an IED incident that had left him with a permanent limp and a reluctance to talk about his time overseas. Jake remembered seeing them displayed in a small wooden case in his father's workshop, polished and preserved with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance, even if he didn't like to boast about it. Jake's phone buzzed insistently on the kitchen counter, but he ignored it, unable to tear his eyes away from the Bronze Star cradled in his palm. The metal was cool against his skin, its ribbon still vibrant despite the years. He turned it over slowly, examining every detail as if it might reveal the secret of its survival. The engraving on the back was unmistakable. Sergeant Michael R. Mitchell, Bronze Star Medal, Operation Iraqi Freedom. The discovery felt surreal, like finding a ghost made tangible. Jake had spent 2 years accepting that these physical reminders of his father's service were gone forever, learning to live with the hollow ache of their absence. He'd grown up hearing fragments of stories about his father's deployments, pieced together from overheard conversations and careful questions that Mike Mitchell would answer with characteristic brevity before changing the subject. The workshop where the medals had been displayed was now his mother's craft room, the military memorabilia replaced with sewing supplies and yarn. Carol had transformed the space within months of Mike's death, claiming she needed a creative outlet to process her grief. Jake had understood, or thought he had, but now he wondered if there had been other motivations for erasing those particular traces of his father's past. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, still displaying the apartment hunting website he'd been browsing earlier. Jake had been considering moving to a larger place, maybe something with a spare bedroom for when his mother visited, but the idea felt less appealing now. The familiar walls of his current apartment suddenly felt like the safest place to process this discovery. Away from prying eyes and well-meaning questions he wasn't ready to answer. The afternoon light streaming through his west-facing windows had shifted while he sat motionless on the floor, casting long shadows across the scattered contents of the collapsed box. Among the photographs and papers, Jake noticed other items he'd missed in his initial shock. A folded flag that had been stored with military precision, a small wooden box that might have contained other medals, and several official-looking documents bearing Department of Defense letterheads. Jake set the Bronze Star carefully on his coffee table and reached for the wooden box. It was crafted from oak, probably military surplus, with brass hinges that had developed a patina over the years. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were empty spaces shaped to hold specific medals. The Purple Heart indent was clearly visible, as were spaces for what appeared to be campaign medals and service ribbons. But the box was empty except for a small piece of paper tucked into one corner. The note was written in his father's careful handwriting, the same methodical script Jake remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. For Jake, when he's ready to understand what these mean, some battles continue long after the war ends. The date on the note was from 3 years ago, nearly a year before his father's death, suggesting this hadn't been a last-minute decision, but a deliberate choice made while Mike was still healthy and planning for the future. Jake's hands shook as he unfolded the Department of Defense documents. They appeared to be some kind of verification records, official confirmations of his father's service medals and decorations. Each medal was listed with its date of award, the specific action that had earned it, and detailed descriptions that painted a picture of courage Jake had never fully understood. His father had downplayed his service, describing it in terms of duty and routine rather than heroism. But these documents told a different story. The Purple Heart citation described an incident where Sergeant Mitchell had continued to provide medical aid to wounded soldiers, despite suffering significant injuries himself from an improvised explosive device. The Bronze Star had been awarded for actions during a convoy ambush where Mike had helped evacuate civilians while under enemy fire. There were other medals listed that Jake didn't remember seeing, a combat medical badge, several campaign medals, and commendations that spoke to years of dedicated service under dangerous conditions. What disturbed Jake most was the contrast between these official records and the story his family had told about the fire. If his father had been careful enough to preserve these documents and write that note, why would he have stored the actual metals with Uncle Tom? Mike Mitchell had been methodical about important things, the kind of man who kept his tools organized and his paperwork filed properly. It seemed out of character for him to entrust such meaningful items to someone else's safekeeping. Jake picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Marcus Rivera's number. Marcus had been his roommate during their brief stint at Ohio State before Jake transferred to engineering school and Marcus enlisted in the Army. They'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, and Jake knew Marcus now worked in some capacity with military records and veteran affairs in Columbus. If anyone could help him understand what he was looking at, it would be Marcus. The call went to voicemail, and Jake found himself struggling to explain the situation concisely. How do you summarize the discovery that your father's supposedly destroyed metal collection might still exist somewhere? How do you voice the growing suspicion that your own family might have lied to you about something so fundamental? Instead, he left a simple message asking Marcus to call him back about a military records question, trying to keep his voice steady and casual. After hanging up, Jake gathered the documents and photographs more carefully, trying to create some order from the chaos on his floor. Among the papers, he found what appeared to be correspondence between his father and various military organizations. One letter, dated just 6 months before Mike's death, was from the Riverside Veterans Memorial Museum, thanking him for his willingness to consider donating his medals to their permanent collection. The museum director had written about the educational value of having local heroes represented in their displays, mentioning specifically that the Bronze Star and Purple Heart would be centerpieces of an exhibit honoring Ohio veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. Jake read the letter twice, feeling his confusion deepen into something darker. His father had been planning to donate the medals to the museum, not store them with Uncle Tom. The timeline didn't match the story he'd been told, and the careful preservation of these documents suggested his father had been taking steps to ensure his legacy would be properly honored. Why, then, had the family claimed the medals were lost in a fire that seemed increasingly questionable with each new piece of evidence? The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in as Jake grappled with implications he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. Outside his window, Denver traffic hummed with the rhythm of a city going about its normal business, oblivious to the small personal crisis unfolding in apartment 312. Jake envied them their certainty, their ability to move through the world, without questioning the fundamental stories they'd been told about their own families. Jake's mind drifted back to the last conversation he'd had with his father, a memory that had taken on new significance in light of his discovery. It had been a humid August evening, just 3 weeks before Mike's unexpected heart attack, and they'd been sitting on the back porch of the family home on Oak Ridge Drive. The cicadas were singing their summer song, and his father had been nursing a beer while watching Jake pack his truck for the drive back to his apartment after a weekend visit. Mike Mitchell had never been a man comfortable with emotional conversations, but something about that evening had felt different. He'd seemed restless, almost agitated, glancing repeatedly toward the house where Carol was cleaning up after dinner. When she'd gone upstairs to take a shower, Mike had leaned forward in his lawn chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly around his beer bottle. "Jake," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying an unusual urgency. "There are things about my service, about what happened over there, that I never talked about. Things your mother doesn't even know." He'd paused, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily. "I always figured there'd be time to explain it all when you were older, when you'd served yourself and could understand better." Jake had felt a familiar frustration at his father's reluctance to open up, but he'd sensed this was different from Mike's usual deflections about his military experience. His father had seemed genuinely troubled, almost anxious in a way that was completely out of character for the steady, unflappable man who'd raised him. "Dad, you can tell me anything," Jake had said, setting down his own beer and giving his father his full attention. "I'm not a kid anymore." But Mike had shaken his head, glancing again toward the house. "Your Uncle Tom thinks I should let sleeping dogs lie. Says there's no point in dredging up old history that can't be changed." His father's expression had darkened slightly when he mentioned Tom, an unusual reaction given how close the brothers had always seemed, But those medals upstairs, they represent more than just my service. They represent promises made and kept, and sacrifices that other people made too. Jake remembered feeling confused by his father's cryptic words, but before he could ask for clarification, Carol had called down from upstairs about helping her move some furniture. The moment had passed, and Mike had retreated back into his usual reserved demeanor. Jake had driven back to his apartment that night with the unsettling feeling that his father had been trying to tell him something important. Something that Uncle Tom apparently didn't want discussed. Now, sitting in his Denver apartment with the Bronze Star evidence of his father's hidden intentions, Jake realized that conversation had been Mike's attempt to prepare him for revelations that death had prevented him from sharing. The mention of Uncle Tom's opposition to dredging up old history took on a sinister cast when viewed alongside the mysterious disappearance of the medal collection. Tom Bradley had always been a presence in Jake's life, the older brother who'd stepped up to help Carol navigate the practical aspects of widowhood. He worked as a counselor at the Riverside VA office, helping veterans access benefits and navigate the bureaucracy of military health care. Jake had always admired his uncle's dedication to serving those who'd served their country, but he'd also noticed how Tom seemed to deflect conversations about his own brief military service in the late 80s. The contrast between the brothers had been stark in many ways. Mike had been quiet but principled, the kind of man who did the right thing even when it was difficult or unpopular. Tom was more gregarious, easier with words and social situations, but Jake had sometimes sensed an underlying current of resentment in his uncle's interactions with his father. It had been subtle, nothing Jake could have articulated at the time, but looking back, he remembered moments when Tom's jokes about Mike's war hero complex had carried an edge that didn't quite seem brotherly. The family dynamics had shifted noticeably after Mike's death. Tom had immediately taken charge of the practical arrangements, handling communications with the VA, organizing the funeral, and coordinating with various military organizations that wanted to honor Mike's service. At the time, Jake had been grateful for his uncle's efficiency and expertise, but now he wondered if Tom's quick action had been motivated by something other than helpfulness. Carol had leaned heavily on Tom's guidance during those overwhelming first months of grief. She'd been married to Mike for 28 years, and his sudden death had left her feeling lost and incapable of making even simple decisions. Tom had stepped into the void with apparent selflessness, helping her navigate insurance claims, pension benefits, and the complex paperwork that follows a veteran's death. He'd been the one to suggest storing Mike's military memorabilia at his house, while Carol decided what to do with it, claiming his basement was more secure and climate-controlled than her garage. Jake remembered visiting Tom and Linda's house on Maple Street about 6 months after the funeral, ostensibly to help with some yard work, but really because his mother had suggested he spend more time with his uncle, who was dealing with his own grief over losing his brother. The house had always been nicer than his parents' modest home, with updates and renovations that seemed to appear regularly despite Tom's government salary. That day, Jake had noticed new furniture in the living room and a expensive-looking sound system that Tom had mentioned buying, quote, to cheer Linda up during this difficult time. When the fire had allegedly destroyed Mike's medals, along with some of Tom's own possessions, Jake had felt terrible for his uncle's loss. Tom had seemed genuinely devastated when he'd called to break the news, his voice breaking as he described watching years of memories go up in flames. The fire department had ruled it an electrical issue, and the insurance investigation had found no signs of foul play. Jake had driven down from Denver for the aftermath, helping Tom and Linda sort through the damage and file claims. But now, with the Bronze Star sitting on his coffee table like an accusation, Jake found himself questioning every detail of that story. If his father had been planning to donate the medals to the museum, why would they have been in Tom's basement during a house fire? The letter from the museum director suggested Mike had been actively engaged in the donation process, not someone who was casually storing his medals at his brother's house while making long-term decisions. The timing bothered Jake too. The fire had occurred almost exactly 1 year after Mike's death, just as Carol was beginning to emerge from the fog of early grief, and might have started asking more pointed questions about her husband's legacy. It had been Tom who'd first suggested that Carol might want to donate Mike's medals somewhere, and it had been Tom who'd volunteered to research the best options. For the medals to be destroyed in a fire while under his care seemed like a cruel irony, Unless it wasn't an accident at all. Jake stood up from his position on the floor, his legs stiff from sitting motionless for so long. The evening shadows had grown longer while he'd been lost to memory, and his apartment felt different now, charged with the energy of secrets beginning to unravel. He walked to his kitchen and pulled a beer from the refrigerator, needing something to steady his nerves as he tried to process the implications of what he was discovering. The refrigerator was covered with the usual collection of takeout menus and utility bills, but prominently displayed in the center was a photo from last Christmas at his mother's house. The whole family was there, Carol looking fragile but trying to smile, Tom and Linda flanking her protectively, their children Ryan and Emma home from college, and trying to maintain holiday cheer, despite the obvious absence of Mike's presence. Jake studied his uncle's face in the photo, looking for signs he might have missed, clues to motivations he was only beginning to understand. Jake's phone finally rang, and Marcus Rivera's name appeared on the screen. Jake grabbed it immediately, grateful for the distraction from his increasingly dark thoughts about his family. "Hey man, got your message," Marcus said, his voice carrying the easy confidence Jake remembered from their college days. "Military records question? That sounds ominous. What's going on?" Jake found himself struggling to explain the situation without sounding paranoid or accusatory. "I found some of my dad's stuff that I thought was destroyed in a fire. Bronze Star. Some documents. I'm trying to figure out if there might be more medals out there somewhere." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Wait, back up. Your dad's Mike Mitchell, right? The guy who served in Iraq? I remember you talking about him." Marcus's tone had shifted slightly, becoming more professional. "You said his medals were destroyed in a fire?" "That's what my family told me. My uncle was storing them, and there was supposedly an electrical fire at his house about a year after Dad died. Everything was lost." Jake walked to his living room window, looking out at the Denver skyline as he spoke. "But I just found this Bronze Star in a box of Dad's papers, along with some correspondence about donating his medals to a museum." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Jake, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. About 6 months ago, I was working on updating some veteran memorial records, and your dad's name came up in a database search. According to our records, his medal collection was never reported as destroyed. In fact, there's been some inquiry activity about his decorations recently." Jake felt his stomach drop. What kind of inquiry activity? Someone's been making requests for verification of his awards, asking for replacement documentation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Usually that happens when people are trying to sell medals or when families are preparing for estate purposes. Marcus paused again. The requests came from Riverside, from someone claiming to be handling estate matters for the family. The beer in Jake's hand suddenly felt too heavy. He set it down on the windowsill and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "When you say someone, do you mean my uncle? Tom Bradley? I can't give you specific names over the phone, but I can tell you that the person making the requests had detailed knowledge of your father's service record and access to his personal information. The kind of access that usually comes from family members or official channels." Marcus's voice had taken on a careful, measured tone. "Jake, if you really found authentic medals that were supposed to be destroyed, you might want to consider that someone in your family hasn't been entirely honest with you." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the world tilt slightly on its axis. Is there a way to track what happened to Dad's medals? Like, officially? There are channels, but they're complicated. Medal collections don't just disappear without paperwork trails, especially for decorated veterans. If someone sold them or transferred them, there should be records somewhere. Marcus hesitated. "But Jake, you need to understand that if medals were sold illegally, especially by someone who wasn't entitled to them, that's a federal crime. The penalties are serious." The weight of what Marcus was suggesting hit Jake like a physical blow. The idea that someone in his family might have deliberately stolen and sold his father's medals felt almost too enormous to process. "What would you do if you were in my situation?" "Honestly, I'd want answers. And I'd want them fast, before any more evidence disappeared." Marcus's voice softened slightly. "Look, I know this is your family we're talking about. But military decorations aren't just pieces of metal. They represent sacrifices that deserve respect. If someone's been profiting off your dad's service, that's not just theft, it's desecration. After hanging up with Marcus, Jake sat in his darkening apartment, trying to make sense of the growing list of inconsistencies. The museum correspondence, the Bronze Star's mysterious survival, the database inquiries, the suspicious timing of the fire. Each piece of evidence pointed toward a conclusion he didn't want to accept. He pulled out his laptop and began searching online for information about the market for military metals. What he found disturbed him deeply. There was an active trade in military decorations, with collectors and dealers buying and selling everything from World War II medals to modern combat awards. Bronze Stars could sell for hundreds of dollars, Purple Hearts for even more, especially when they came with documentation proving their authenticity. The websites Jake found were careful to emphasize that they only dealt in legally obtained metals, but the comments sections told a different story. People discussed buying metals from estate sales and family members who needed quick cash. Some dealers seemed to ask very few questions about provenance, especially for common decorations like Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. Jake found himself searching for his father's name in various metal collecting forums and auction sites. He didn't find anything immediately, but the search results included several Ohio-based dealers who specialized in modern military decorations. One dealer in Columbus advertised that he worked directly with veteran families to, quote, preserve military heritage through responsible collecting. The more Jake read, the more he understood how easy it would be for someone with access to a veteran's records to sell their metals. Most buyers wouldn't question a family member claiming to sell inherited decorations, especially if the seller could provide documentation proving the metal's authenticity. The verification letters Jake had found in his father's papers would be exactly the kind of documentation that would make stolen metals appear legitimate. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. Haven't heard from you in a while, honey. Hope the move preparations are going well. Uncle Tom was asking about you today, wondering if you need any help with your deployment paperwork. The message felt different now, loaded with implications Jake hadn't considered before. Why would Uncle Tom be asking about his deployment paperwork? Tom certainly had the expertise to help with military bureaucracy, but Jake had been handling his National Guard obligations independently for years. The timing of the question, coming just as Jake was discovering evidence of his father's hidden intentions, felt suspicious rather than helpful. Jake stared at his mother's message for several minutes before responding with a non-committal, "Thanks, doing fine, we'll call soon." He wasn't ready to have a conversation with Carol yet, not until he understood more about what had really happened to his father's metals. But he also wasn't ready to ignore the growing evidence that someone in his family had betrayed his father's trust and his memory. The apartment felt too quiet, too isolated for the magnitude of what he was contemplating. Jake found himself missing the background noise of Riverside, the small-town rhythms that had once felt suffocating, but now seemed comforting compared to the anonymous urban landscape outside his window. In Riverside, secrets were harder to keep, but they were also harder to uncover when family members closed ranks to protect each other. Jake picked up the Bronze Star again, running his thumb over the raised relief of the star design. The metal felt solid, real, undeniable in its authenticity. Whatever lies had been told about its destruction, whatever complicated family dynamics had led to this moment, the Bronze Star was proof that his father's legacy deserved better than whatever had happened to it. He thought about his upcoming deployment, about following in his father's footsteps into service and possibly into combat. The idea of serving without understanding what had happened to his father's own record of service felt wrong, incomplete. Jake realized he couldn't move forward with his own military career until he knew the truth about Mike Mitchell's stolen legacy and who in the family had been responsible for taking it. The drive from Denver to Riverside took Jake 8 hours, but he made it in 7, pushing his truck harder than he should have through the Colorado mountains and across the Kansas plains. He'd left at 4 in the morning, unable to sleep after spending the night researching military metal dealers and estate fraud cases. The Bronze Star rode in the passenger seat, wrapped carefully in a towel, while copies of his father's documents filled a manila folder on the dashboard. Jake had called in sick to work, something he'd never done without being genuinely ill, but the weight of what he'd discovered made normal life impossible. His supervisor had been understanding, commenting that Jake had been working too many overtime hours lately and probably needed the break. If only he knew that Jake was driving toward a confrontation that could destroy his family, rather than taking a relaxing personal day. The familiar landscape of rural Ohio appeared as Jake crested a hill outside of Riverside, and he felt his chest tighten with a mixture of homecoming nostalgia and dread. The water tower with the high school mascot painted on its side, the grain elevator that had been a landmark since his childhood, the Veterans Memorial Park where his father's name was engraved on a granite wall honoring local service members. Everything looked exactly the same, but Jake felt like he was seeing it all through different eyes. He drove past his mother's house first, noting that her car was gone. Carol volunteered at the library on Thursday mornings, a routine she'd maintained even after Mike's death as a way of staying connected to the community. Jake was grateful for the reprieve. He wasn't ready to see his mother until he'd confronted Uncle Tom and gotten some answers. Tom Bradley's house on Maple Street looked prosperous in the afternoon sunlight. The lawn was meticulously maintained, the driveway had been recently sealed, and Jake noticed that the siding had been replaced since his last visit. For a VA counselor's salary, Tom seemed to be doing remarkably well for himself. Jake parked across the street and sat for several minutes, trying to calm his nerves and plan his approach. The front door opened before Jake had even reached the porch steps. Tom emerged with a surprised smile, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that looked expensive. "Jake, what are you doing here? Your mom didn't mention you were coming for a visit." "Mom doesn't know I'm here," Jake said, noting how his uncle's smile flickered slightly at that information. "I need to talk to you about Dad's medals." Tom's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Son, you know how sorry I am about what happened in the fire. I still feel terrible about losing those medals. Your dad would have wanted you to have them." Jake pulled the bronze star from his jacket pocket, watching as Tom's face went pale. "This bronze star says otherwise. Funny thing about fires, Uncle Tom. They're supposed to destroy everything, but somehow this survived." The color drained completely from Tom's face, and he glanced nervously at the neighboring houses as if worried about who might be watching. "Jake, you don't understand. This is complicated. Why don't you come inside, and we can talk about this properly?" Inside the house, Jake noticed details he'd missed before. The furniture was all high-end, the electronics were top of the line, and original artwork hung on the walls. The basement door was closed, and Jake found himself wondering what else might be hidden down there. "Linda was at work," Tom explained, seeming nervous about having this conversation without his wife present. "I found Dad's correspondence with the museum, too," Jake said, settling into an expensive leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He was planning to donate his medals, not store them here. "So why don't you tell me what really happened to them?" Tom sat heavily on the couch, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his graying hair. For several long moments, he didn't speak, and Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across his uncle's features. Finally, Tom looked up with eyes that held a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Your father was going to waste them," Tom said quietly. "Do you have any idea what those medals are worth? The Bronze Star alone could bring in $800, maybe $1,000, with the right documentation. The Purple Heart, even more. And Mike was just going to give them away to some museum where they'd sit in a display case, forgotten." Jake felt his anger building, but he kept his voice level. "So you stole them." "I preserved them," Tom shot back, his voice rising. "I found buyers who appreciated their historical value, collectors who would treasure them properly. And yes, I kept some of the money, but I've been helping your mother with expenses she doesn't even know about. The property taxes, the house repairs, the medical bills that are still coming in. Where do you think that money came from?" "From Mom's pension and Dad's VA benefits," Jake said, though even as he spoke, he realized he'd never actually seen the paperwork for those payments. Tom laughed bitterly. "Your father's pension barely covers the mortgage, and the VA benefits are a joke. I've been supplementing your mother's income for 2 years, and she's never had to worry about money because of the sacrifices I made." The word sacrifices hit Jake like a slap. "You mean the sacrifice of selling Dad's medals to fund your lifestyle? This house, the new car I saw in the garage, Linda's jewelry collection. How much of that came from my father's service record?" You don't understand what it was like, Tom said, standing and beginning to pace. Mike was always the hero. Always the one everyone looked up to. Perfect son, perfect soldier, perfect husband. Do you know what it's like living in the shadow of someone like that your entire life? I served too, Jake. I wore the uniform too. But nobody ever talked about my service because it wasn't dramatic enough, wasn't heroic enough. Jake stared at his uncle, seeing clearly for the first time the resentment and jealousy that had apparently festered for decades. So this was revenge? This was justice, Tom snapped. Mike got all the glory while I got all the responsibility. When he died, I was the one who had to handle everything, take care of everyone, make the hard decisions. The least he could do was help pay for it. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock that Jake now suspected had been purchased with his father's stolen legacy. He thought about all the times Tom had comforted the family, had stepped up to help, had seemed like the devoted brother dealing with his own grief. It had all been an act, a performance designed to cover up systematic theft. I want them back, Jake said finally. All of them. Every medal, every ribbon, every piece of documentation you sold. Tom's laugh was hollow. That's impossible, Jake. They're scattered across the country now in private collections, some probably resold multiple times. You can't undo what's been done. Then I want the money. Every cent you made from Dad's service, with interest. Jake stood up, pulling out his phone. Or, I call the FBI and report you for federal theft of military decorations. Your choice, Uncle Tom, but either way, this ends today. Tom's face cycled through several emotions: anger, fear, calculation, and finally, resignation. He walked to a desk in the corner and pulled out a folder thick with papers. The sales records are all here. Documentation of what sold and for how much. But Jake, you have to understand, most of that money is already spent or invested. I can't just write you a check for the full amount. Jake took the folder, his hands trembling with rage as he saw page after page of auction records and private sales. His father's Purple Heart had sold for $1,200. Campaign medals had gone for amounts ranging from $50 to $300 each. In total, Tom had stolen and sold nearly $8,000 worth of Mike Mitchell's military decorations. You have 72 hours, Jake said, heading toward the door. Liquidate whatever you need to liquidate, borrow money, sell this house if you have to. But I want every penny, or the FBI gets this folder, and you explain to a federal judge why you thought my father's service was worth less than your comfort. Tom called after him as Jake walked toward his truck, but Jake didn't turn around. He had 2 more stops to make in Riverside before driving back to Denver. First, he was going to the Riverside Veterans Memorial Museum to honor his father's original intentions. Then he was going to tell his mother the truth about her brother-in-law and let her decide how much family loyalty was worth when measured against honor and honesty. As Jake drove away from Maple Street, he called Marcus Rivera. I found them, he said when Marcus answered. Well, I found where they went. My uncle sold Dad's entire medal collection and has been living off the proceeds for 2 years. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to get justice for my father, Jake said, looking at the bronze star on his passenger seat. Even if it's 2 years late. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.